The movie begins with Nick celebrating his birthday party, and his mother reflects on the challenges of raising him alone after his father's death, but expresses pride in the person he has become. Following her speech, she presents Nick with a gift, but his disappointment is evident upon opening it. He strolls away from the gathering, heads to slice a portion of the cake, and retreats to the storage room where he eats the cake. After consuming the cake, he takes a gun and attempts to shoot himself. However, upon pulling the trigger, he suddenly awakens. During breakfast with his mom, he talks to her about a writer's program in London, but she doesn't support it. She tells him the program won't mean anything to him. He is angry and leaves his breakfast and goes to school. At school, he puts his book in his locker, and another student comes to buy French answers from him. He gets his money, and his girlfriend comes to meet him. As they leave, she invites him to a party the next day, but he declines, saying he won't attend. In the next scene, Pete, another student, becomes the target of bullying from a group of boys. While they continue to physically harm him, their leader, a young girl named Annie, approaches. She brings out a blade and threatens to cut him. In class, a student presented his poem, and following his presentation, the teacher requested Nick to share his poem as well. He proceeds to read it, but the school bell rings soon after, and the students go for lunch. During lunch, Nick meets his best friend Pete, and he tells him about what Annie and the gang did. Nick urges Pete to assert himself, but Pete claims he can't grasp his emotions. In frustration, Nick confronts Annie, labels her as broken, and leaves. Annie watches him leave, then strikes from behind when he reaches the middle. They're summoned to the principal's office, and as they wait, Annie questions whether he sees himself as superior due to being a golden student. She points out to him that he sells answers too, and they are the same. He agrees with her and admits to being a hypocrite. The principal, aware of Annie's troubled nature, instructs her to leave upon arrival. Later, he questions Nick about his actions. He reminds Nick not to be bothered by Annie, as she doesn't have a future, but he does. However, Nick doesn't reply and asks if he can leave. At home, Annie finds her hungry brother and questions her stepmother about it, but receives an angry backlash in return. After preparing sandwiches, she puts on her headphones and affirms her departure when her brother asks. Meanwhile, Pete visits Nick's home and brings money for some answers. He asks Nick about the party the following night, but Nick declines. He shows Pete his London ticket and says he is going to London without his mother's consent. That night, Annie and her boyfriend, an ex-convict, Marcus, go to rob a jewelry store. She breaks the window and picks up the jewelry. The following morning, she awakens and gets ready for school, expressing her desire to bring the jewelry bag with her. When Marcus suggests she leave it behind, she declines and walks away. In frustration, he calls the police to report the alleged theft. At school, Annie stows the bag in her locker, and upon shutting it, catches Pete staring at her. While in class, the police arrive to inspect her locker, where they discover the stolen jewelry and proceed to arrest her. At the police station, she calls Marcus and reports that she has been caught. He questions if she's aware he's the one who reported her, and when he inquires about the informant, she confirms, pledging to handle the situation. She assumes Pete is the culprit and plans to teach him a lesson. At home, Nick's mom finds out about his plane ticket, and she is disappointed. She tells him that the company had called to inform him that his time has been changed, and she is disappointed that he would have gone without telling him. That evening, Annie and her gang ambush Pete and hit him. To save himself, he tells her Nick ratted her out. Meanwhile, Nick decides to attend the party and meets his girlfriend. He asks if she wants to go to London and gives her the ticket. They make out in a room, but he doesn't do much before leaving. On his way home, Annie drives behind and hits him into the bush. Her boys hit him while Pete begs her to stop. She goes to hit Nick, asking him who is broken between them, but he insists she is the broken one, so she angrily pushes him and he hits his head. They realize he is no longer breathing and leave him in a ditch. Annie fearfully goes to confess to Marcus, who asks why she came when she knows he is on parole. He chases her away and he destroys some of his stuff, but kisses him ironically before leaving. In the next scene, Nick wakes the following day without any injury. He leaves the ditch and goes to school. That is when he realizes his presence goes unnoticed. Despite his screams and actions within the classroom, no one acknowledges his presence. He goes to the principal's office to use the phone and witnesses the principal taking a call from his mother inquiring about him. He talks, but his mother doesn't hear. Later, he goes home and watches the detectives search his house. His worried mom insists she knows him well, and he won't leave without telling her. But the detective sarcastically asks if she knows about the plane ticket. The next day, the detective sees the tire path in the trees and checks. He calls a search party into the woods, and another detective informs him of Nick's issue with Annie. Turns out he knows Annie before. He goes to see Annie and inquires about her whereabouts for the day. However, she responds that she is with Marcus and not involved with Nick in any way. Furious, Nick throws her off the roof, but nothing happens. In the room, Annie calls Pete and tells him to attend the search party, which makes Nick wonder about their relationship. At home, Nick sees a bird and holds it. It gives him some hope until the bird disappears, which makes him feel he will soon vanish forever. He runs to the woods and tries to direct the party to where his body is. He talks with the dog, who initially does as if he could see him, but turns later. Eventually, the dog finds his watch and seals the assumption that his body is there. Later, the police interrogate Marcus. He admits to being with Annie the day Nick went missing, but claims he knows nothing about the theft. Annie realizes she will soon be caught, so she takes her luggage and leaves home. Her brother pleads with her to return and avoid meeting the same fate as their mother. She cautions her father that her brother must be kept safe, and she emotionally collapses. However, Nick advises her to refrain from placing blame on anyone other than herself. Nick also sees that his mom is continuing with her perfect life. He scatters the entire house, accusing her of her life being imperfect. Suddenly, he sees her break down and realizes she is also broken. Marcus feels they will be caught, so he ambushes Pete and tells him to take him to Nick's body. Pete eventually takes him there, and they take the body away. The following day, he tries to corner Annie by bringing her to a bridge, but Annie asks Pete to go instead. However, Marcus gets Annie there at gunpoint and they confront each other. The police arrive and Annie jumps off. As she runs away, Nick tells her she will be caught, but she screams, never making Nick realize she could hear her. He follows her to the bar where she sells one of his rings for money and dances at the club. He joins her there and follows her until she keeps some money for her brother in the locker. Nick continues to engage in conversation with her, yet she senses his voice echoing in her mind. For when she turns, she sees no one. He sleeps beside her at school and wakes later after she has left. He follows her to her mother's grave and confesses he wishes his mother had died instead of his father. She visits his house, inspects his property, but flees when his mother arrives. Annie decides to rescue Nick, but when she gets to the ditch, his body is no longer there. She confronts Pete in school to find out where his body is. Pete confesses that Nick didn't rat her out and tells her he moved the body with Marcus. She ambushes Marcus at gunpoint and takes him to a mountain, threatening to throw him off. Meanwhile, Pete decides to kill himself. Upon collapsing, his essence connects with Nick's spirit, and he reveals the location of the body near the dam. On the other hand, Marcus also discloses the location of the body to Annie. Yet before Annie departs, they exchange gunfire. Luckily, Pete's parents enter and save him, and Nick runs to where his body is. He sees the dam is about to wash his body away. While struggling, Annie calls the detective and reports where the body is, asking that they give the money in the locker to her brother. The detectives arrive and they search for the body. They find Nick with no pulse and rush him to the hospital. Meanwhile, Nick voices that he needs Annie, and this alerts her to rush and sneak into the hospital. Bypassing the police, Nick directs her to where he is, but meets his furious mother who wants to report her. Annie attempts to convey that Nick was the one who sent her, but his mother refuses to hear her. In an effort to persuade, Annie recounts the incident when she visits Nick's room and read his poem. She considers and allows her to see Nick. Annie lays beside Nick and holds his hand. That is when Nick finally wakes, and Annie says she wants to do a good deed while she taps out soon after. Sometime later, Nick meets Annie's brother at a mountain. The boy complains that Annie is supposed to bring him here, but she is no longer around. Nick suggests they send a message to Annie by writing it on the plane and throwing it up as the movie ends. Subscribe to watch more videos like this, leave a like to help the channel out, also comment if you'd like us to recap your favorite movie. Thanks for watching.